You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
Nationalism. Nothing wrong with standing for your country, right? Nothing wrong with working to make your country better. Great again. Not like those globalists or imperialists.
But radical Democrats want to turn back the clock. Or the rule of corrupt, power-hungry globalists. You know what a globalist is, right? You know what a globalist is. A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that.
Being a nationalist just means focusing on your own country, right? Focusing on making your own country better, minding your own business. So what's the deal with the title then? What does Donald Trump have to do with anything? Sure, Donald Trump calls himself a nationalist, but there's nothing wrong with that, right? Isn't that what people want? For him to mind his own business and make America great again?
But Mia, isn't the term nationalist far too vague and now dated as a political label to accurately derive significant political meaning? Especially in the current political climate, which has been built on the evolution of political discourse over the last 200 years.
That's technically true. You can derive meaning from a word using two different ways, either by its original meaning or by the meaning that people usually associate with the word. That's what words mean. If everyone believes a word to mean something, then that is what the word means. That's what language is. When it comes to political labels, and nationalism specifically, these definitions tend to be muddled. But you read the title, you know what my opinion on nationalism already is before you even clicked on it. But before I go into why you should agree with me or not, and you should, because I'm always correct, I want to give a small history lesson, kind of, to show that the issue is not maybe as black and white as you think it might be. Maybe Donald Trump is actually doing a good thing by calling himself a nationalist. You know, maybe. Although, like, let's be... To understand modern political labels, we need to understand the thematic and literal origin of the term. The term nationalism gained popularity during the World Wars, but its ideological predecessor can be seen since long before that. Arguably, the first nationalist movement was the American independence movement, leading, of course, to the independence of the United States as a country. Not just because it established itself as an independent colony, but because it created a national identity. You weren't a British subject, or necessarily even British anymore. You were American, which meant something. It meant something more than just being a white guy with a heritage from England, although, let's be fair, that is pretty, practically what it actually meant for a long time. But supposedly it could mean more things than that, like eating steak and loving freedom! The creation of a national identity is key to the understanding of nationalism. No matter where the term is used, national identity is still around. I mean, most of us still identify with a political ideology trying to further the goals of a nation, even if we might not agree about what those goals are. A nation doesn't necessarily have to be a state or a country. It can often just refer to a group of people who are united by the things that they share in common. And again, it doesn't have to have a state associated with it. But historically and over the last 200 years, nations with states have either assimilated or suppressed nations that don't. And that nation can be many different American colonies fighting to unify themselves as an independent state. Or of course it can be any group of people united by the shared oppression of an outside threat. And usually in these cases, they form a national identity that is usually created in opposition to empire. And it's usually one empire. And that's important, because nationalism doesn't necessarily base itself on heritage or shared backgrounds. It can be created from scratch. Also, there's pan-nationalism, working often to unify a nation of people who aren't united in a nation or a state. For example, Irish nationalism, usually being described as working towards unifying Ireland, containing then, of course, the northern parts. In the modern day, nationalism is a term usually associated with the right wing. But historically, this has not been the case. Many nationalists have been left-wing, trying to create a unified workers' state, for example. Usually something that can withstand the forces of outside aggression, that is driven by the bourgeoisie or some other thing. And these types of nationalism are also driven in opposition to empire. And again, it's usually that empire. Although, let's be fair, the French had one too. So is Donald Trump doing a good thing here? Is he trying to unite a very divided America on ideology? Is he putting America first and making America great again? It's back. What is that? It's back. Why does that keep coming up? While you could drive a nationalist argument on the basis of trying to create a unified socialist state, the reality is more complicated, and there's a very specific type of nationalism called racial nationalism. In the West, this is the type of nationalism we refer to as white nationalism, because that is the race of the people driving the racial nationalist argument. This is the type of nationalism that can be ascribed to people who want to create ethno-states, because they want to create a state, a nation for a very specific type of people, which is white people. But it's important to note that this can be applied to any people. It's just that, from our perspective, in the Western world, it's mostly been white people who do this. In these cases, the national idea is not necessarily based on class or history or culture or language. It is based on ethnicity, which, as the name implies, ties a person's nationality directly to their ethnicity. This expresses itself in many different ways. The most extreme example of this that most people have heard of is the Nuremberg laws, which directly stripped Jewish Germans from being German. But it can also express itself in less direct ways. For example, tying a person's right to vote to their ethnicity, for example. Because if you can't partake in the nation that you exist within, then you're not really belonging to that national identity anymore. And if you have been excluded from the nation in any way because of your ethnicity, that means that the nation has to be, at least in part, ethnically based. But what is Donald Trump then? Is he a racial nationalist? I mean, he hasn't gone out and said that black people can't vote. In fact, he says he loves black people.
Look at my African American over here. Look at him. Are you the greatest? Do you know what I'm talking about?
All he did was call himself nationalist, which in itself can mean anything, right? I've already covered a couple of examples of what nationalism can mean. Everything from leftist nationalism to pan-nationalism to racial nationalism. But there are even more types of nationalism than I can even mention here.
There is no way I'm going through all of that.
So what's wrong with just generic nationalism? keeping the nation's interests first. Isn't that what all political ideologies these days kind of want? I don't see a lot of political ideologies saying that we should prioritize the interest of other people before ourselves. America First doesn't seem like that bad of a political ideology for an American political party. And he didn't say that non-white people aren't allowed to vote, so I don't think that he can really be described as a racial nationalist. Right? Maybe he's even a left-wing nationalist. I mean, who knows, really? He does like jobs, so, and that's, the left love jobs, right? They love jobs. Well, at least we know this. He's not an imperialist, right? I mean, ProggerU has told us that. The opposite of nationalism is imperialism. And he has described himself as a nationalist, which means that, you know, at least he's not an imperialist, is he? Ah! There is an understanding between right-wing thought leaders that nationalism is something else than imperialism, and you can see why. If you focus on your own country, then you're not as interested in trying to fuck with other countries. At least that's the theory. By using some definitions of nationalism, this is technically true. It can even seem isolationist to some, but once you actually look at what history is, you realize quickly that that makes absolutely no goddamn sense whatsoever. The problem arises when you examine what the demands are made from the national identity. What is the nation according to the nationalist? Those are the specifics that we need to understand and define. Once we know that, then we can start getting into the business of other things. But I'm gonna talk about that in a couple of minutes. Which means that I have eventually, when we talk about nationalism, I have to talk about the Germans. Oh, this isn't about the Nazis. Yet. The German Empire is a stellar example of nationalism. The idea of a unified German state was popularized in large part because of an existing outside threat. The French, in this case. In some way, creating the German Empire was a way to protect yourself from the concept of empire. However, once the unification was done, Central Europe suddenly had a massive ball of angry industry. The national idea of unifying to survive against outside aggression quickly faded, and the new national identity emerged of a great German Empire. But then the First World War ended, and suddenly there were many people who spoke German, who maybe identified as German, who did not live within the German nation. And then in come the Nazis, building their ideology on the nationalist ideals of the past, unifying all German nations under one, starting with annexing Austria, and then more German-speaking land. And then we need land for the Germans to settle. The nationalist idea of Germany no longer aligned with the actual de facto borders of the world. It didn't align with reality. But that doesn't matter to a nationalist. What matters to a nationalist is the ideal, the theoretical nation that you could have.
Nationalism holds that borders are crucial. The border is where each nation's ambitions should stop.
What ProggerU says there is technically correct. It just happens that the German nation didn't fit within the borders of what the world considered to be the German nation. The same argument still remained, a pan-German argument, unifying all Germans under one nation. But this time it was used as a prelude to war, to expansion. The trouble then becomes, is Germany acting on nationalist interests here, or are they imperialist? The modern right wing would say that they are clearly imperialist. They are messing with the affairs of other nations. End of discussion. But I would say in this example, there's no real difference. The nationalist idea can only be furthered by imperialism. In the ideal world and in theory, nationalism is perfect. Every nationalist ideal would already align with the world as it is. All peoples would be contented to belong to the nation that they belong to and furthering the goals of that nation. There would be no need for imperialism. There would be no need to further nationalist ideas using imperialism as the tool. But Prague fails to realize that history exists. I mean, I don't have to go to the Nazis to talk about why nationalist ideals are imperialist. You have that in America. Manifest destiny? Anyone? How about you manifest some fucking literature, John O'Sullivan, before I grab your corpse to Santa? Manifest destiny is a peak example of when nationalist ideas are inherently imperialist. Manifest destiny is also specifically national mysticism. Manifest destiny is the idea that America as a nation was destined by God to stretch from coast to coast. This was a nationalist ideal. This was the idea that America as a nation personified belonged as a certain shape. It was an idea specifically in the interest of the American nation. And this was an idea that was shared by many people, not just some specific bigwigs in Washington or something. This was an idea that was shared by millions of people, and it was seen as part of being American. It is also a narrative that has sustained itself within the national consciousness. The entire idea of the frontline settler taming the American West is a result of manifest destiny. Yeehaw! It wouldn't be possible without the idea of manifest destiny. Even the most American thing of all, the cowboy, wouldn't really be as possible as it is without the nationalist ideal of manifest destiny. Even the song Sea to Shining Sea is just a song about what America could and should be. But if you consider just one other perspective, it's clearly imperialist. The land that was used to sustain manifest destiny didn't just come from nowhere. For the Mexicans living in the territory claimed by the United States, it was clearly an outside foreign force invading. For the Native Americans whose land would be taken from them and given to white settlers, it was clearly an imperialist move, by many seen as a justification of genocide. So nationalism can have the term of being a progressive, unifying, protective force. But from another perspective, that protective force can also be devastatingly imperialist. Without any context and from one perspective alone, the analogy holds up. Nationalism and imperialism are different things. But if you consider just like the perspective of another person at all, that falls apart. Theoretically, they are different, but in many cases, when it comes down to brass tacks, there's no difference really. That's partly because almost all modern political ideologies are in some form based in nationalism. It's hard for us to even grasp what a world would look like without nationalism. Imagine geopolitical diplomacy without the concept of a nation or a state. It's mind-boggling because that is what the world has been for a very long period of time. Nationalism is, in theory, perfect. If you have one nation, you want to focus on making that nation better, right? Staying within your own borders, sure, I think most people can agree with that. But what happens when the national ideal goes beyond the de facto borders that nations currently abide by? This is the case with both manifest destiny in America and Lebensraum in Nazi Germany. And when it comes down to it, there's really no way of knowing where Trump lies in all of this. So the term is even more complicated. It's not even dedicatedly left-wing, right-wing. We can't even really distinguish it from imperialism. But sometimes we can. But we go back to the question, what does this mean then? Is Donald Trump calling himself a nationalist as opposing to imperialism? Is he saying it to say something about unifying as a nation? Is he saying it as a dog whistle about racial nationalism? We can't identify the original meaning behind the term simply because there are too many of them. The term nationalist is really too vague. And that's really the issue, isn't it? But I know how we can solve it. Donald Trump Ugh! From all of this chaos, where is the meaning? Where is the meaning in all of these terms, in all of these different meanings behind words? These terms are hell. But if the term is so vague, is nationalism even an ideology at this point? Is anyone a nationalist? Am I a nationalist? Nationalism as an ideology isn't really an ideology. At least not the way we view political ideologies today. Instead, it's more like a genre of ideology. A type, a format of ideology. Nationalism, in its most basic form, is about identifying with other people with a shared history, language, culture, whatever. Whatever your nation is, your tribe. But what nationalism means in politics is about aligning the resources and powers of a country or a state with the interests of the nation, the interest of the people, so to say. Today, this is fairly obvious. This is how most countries operate, even if they define working for the people a bit differently. Nationalism grew in popularity in response to monarchism, which isn't about aligning the resources of the country with the nation, but rather with the monarch. The nation isn't what creates the state. The monarch is the state. Monarchism also says that the monarch knows best. They are ordained by God, after all. What this usually means is aligning the interests and the goals of a nation with the interests of the specific monarch. And that usually in practice means cake for the king and nothing for the peasants. The monarch knows best, after all. Nationalism then says that we should be loyal to the nation rather than the monarch. The nation itself becomes a sort of leader to follow. You don't fight for the king, you fight for America. And what is a nation if not the people, rather than the crown? This makes nationalism sound pretty democratic, actually. But remember, fighting for the people means different things for different people. Hitler did fight for the German people, after all. Instead, nationalism works for the sovereignty of the people. And this is pretty much the case of every single country on the globe today. Either because they themselves decided to be a nation, a state, or because they were forced into nationalism in response to colonialism and imperialism. And this is pretty much the case for every country around the world. Most people around the world identify with the nation that they currently exist within. But there are peoples who aren't sovereign. There are nations that are still fighting for independence or sovereignty, whatever that means. But nations is the default way that people align themselves in international politics these days. The idea of nationalism is so mainstream that it's kind of hard to imagine a world without it. Nationalism then becomes a very vague and complicated ideology to describe because almost all modern political ideologies kind of stem from a very specific offshoot of nationalism. Nationalism doesn't fit into the spectrum of left-right politics. Instead, nationalism is the spectrum. Even the most staunch royalists who want to fuck the Queen probably don't actually want the Queen to have absolute political power. Although, maybe that is what will take to fix Brexit. So nationalism is still an ideology. It's just that it hasn't been very relevant because it has been around. It has been the default state of politics for over a century. And people do describe themselves as nationalists, after all. But why? If nationalism is the default state of politics, and almost all political ideologies are nationalist to some degree, why does Donald Trump and other right-wingers call themselves nationalist? Why do many people defend nationalism? Why is there a reason to do that? Well, as I mentioned, there are many types of nationalism. But there's this specific type of nationalism that stands above the others, where nationalism itself, the idea of the nation, is the ideology. Nationalism 2, nationalism plus, nationalism XL. God! The only practical reason that I can think of why someone would describe themselves as a nationalist in the current political climate where everything is nationalist to some degree is ultra-nationalism. Ultra-nationalism describes an ideology that is so nationalist that even within the generic state of nationalism everywhere, where we all kind of accept that we should all have countries and nations and borders and stuff like that, not everyone agrees with that, but that is what the world looks like currently. Even then, it stands out as being nationalist. This isn't just putting America first or siding with your nation. That's just normal nationalism. Ultra-nationalism, however, promises absolute loyalty to the nation at any cost, even at the expense of other nations, other peoples, or even its own people. It places the nation as inherently superior to all others. The nation is the best thing in the world. Ultranationalism also comes often with authoritarianism, racism, and xenophobia. Those damn illegals, they aren't American! Since nationalism is pretty much fulfilled in most places of the world, unless you're fighting to rid yourself of imperial rule, stating that you are a nationalist just adds to the normal nationalism of the default, which naturally places you within the realm of ultra-nationalism. And it's not like you have to look very far to see the signs of ultra-nationalism within the right wing that I have just described. The reason they think that they can get away with it is because of what I spoke of in the beginning. Nationalism is a very vague term. Nationalism doesn't actually mean that much in itself in the current political climate unless you understand the history of the term and how it has been used. The right wing currently calls themselves nationalist to preemptively undermine the descriptions of them as ultra-nationalist. I mean, as a nationalist, like we all are, right? We're all nationalists. It's normal to be a nationalist. You should be a nationalist. Everyone should be a nationalist. How do you do, fellow ideologies? So it's deliberate, and they are aware of the term. They know everything that I've said in this video. People who describe themselves as nationalists, they know what ultra-nationalism means. And they know that they don't want to be associated with it.
You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
And I don't think I can convince people who are already deep in the ultra-nationalist argument. But if you're on the fence of nationalism, perhaps within American discourse, know what they mean by that. Make sure that you know what they mean when they say nationalism.
Yeah, I agree. I actually don't have any problems at all with the word nationalism. I think that it gets, the definition gets poisoned by elitists that actually want globalism. Globalism is what I don't want. So when you think about, whenever we say nationalism, the first thing people think about, at least in America, is Hitler. You know, he was a National Socialist, but if Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The problem is that he had dreams outside of Germany. He wanted to globalize. He wanted everybody to be German, everybody to be speaking German, everybody to look a different way. That's not, to me, that's not nationalism. So and thinking about how it could go bad down the line, I don't really have an issue with nationalism. I really don't. I think that it's okay. It's important to retain your country's identity and to make sure that what's happening here, which I think is incredibly worrisome in terms of the decrease in the birth rate that we're seeing in the UK, is what you kind of want to avoid. So I don't have anything problem. I have no problems with nationalism. It's globalism that I try to avoid.
Technically, it's true that Hitler wasn't a nationalist, in the sense that most nations and most politicians are nationalist. Hitler wasn't a nationalist like any other. He was an ultra-nationalist, which means that Hitler was a nationalist, just he wasn't like other nationalists. I think most people are nationalists, even leftists. As I said before, it's basically the ideological foundation of most modern ideologies, at least from the 1800s and forward. It's just that Hitler's nationalism wasn't the default zeitgeisty nationalism that we see in other political ideologies. They went above and beyond that. Hence the word ultra, meaning more nationalism, ultra-nationalism. Oh, and I want to make clear here, I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a Nazi by saying this. I am saying that in a certain field of political ideology, Donald Trump and Hitler share a very wide ideological base. I do believe that they are both ultra-nationalist and that they have that in common. But ultra-nationalism, like normal nationalism, doesn't fit neatly into the spectrum of left-right politics. It all depends on the national ideas and ideals that the nation itself has. I'm still saying that the Nazis were right-wing extremists, though. They were. They did a lot more than just be ultra-nationalists, after all. But it is technically possible for leftists to be ultra-nationalists too. It all has to do with the national ideas that you base the nationalism on, and what you base the inherent superiority of your nation on. And that can be race, as with the Nazis, but it can technically also be class belonging, lack of class, anything that you think makes a nation inherently superior to other nations is something that can fall within the ultra-nationalist field of ideology. God damn, I've talked so much about the Nazis now. I want to talk about Trump. Like, this video was about Trump, right? I'm not gonna talk about the Nazis all day. This video was about Donald Trump. Isn't he gonna make America great again? Listen, I know the term isn't perfect. There are contradictions in how words and terms are used within nationalism. And that's fine. Nationalism has been around for over 200 years. Weird things happen. That's sort of the consequence of these terms existing in the real world and not just in an academic theoretical setting. We need to look at how the terms are actually applied in real life. And we have seen historically how nationalism has been used to fight imperialism, to fight oppression, but also we've seen how nationalism can be used as an excuse for genocide and imperialist expansion. It's a term that has been used by all sorts of people for their own ends, and it's hard to describe the term as belonging to a specific field of ideology. It's a very generic term. Nationalism on its own can mean anything. But if you only identify as nationalist alone, without context, you leave the viewer to connect the dots themselves. And that only leads to one way. It leads to ultra-nationalism. You describe yourself as a nationalist. We live in a world of nationalism. I can only assume you mean nationalism plus nationalism then, which just means more nationalism, hence ultra-nationalism. Or you can do what the American right wing has done and ignore any contradiction, or ignore the history of the word, or ignore anything about it, and just decide a new meaning of the word nationalism. If they could preface or contextualize their own identification as nationalist to something that isn't ultra-nationalist, they would have done that. But they can't. They lie about the history of the ideology and how the ideology of nationalism has been applied in real life. It's telling that they often refer to Hitler, right? Saying that Hitler wasn't a nationalist. And that's an easy answer. It's more easy to digest than the complicated answer of Hitler was a nationalist. But so are most people. Most political parties, almost all political parties around the world, are in some capacity nationalist. And most of us exist on the spectrum that nationalism has provided, which means that we need to know about the spectrum. And also that there are alternatives beyond it. We don't have to be nationalist, and the alternative to nationalism isn't necessarily monarchism, or feudalism, or whatever. It can be something else. It can be something beyond that. Modern politics focuses a lot on economy and social issues within the nation. But politics can be so much more than that. Ideology can be so much more than that. We can form our own desires beyond just economic and social. If we want, we can picture a world that is fundamentally different to the one we have right now. In every single way, down to how we have borders, if we should have borders, and we can use political ideology and philosophy to imagine a world that isn't necessarily based on nations at all. And maybe that's a better world. Maybe it's a worse one. But we can't have the discussion without knowing that the possibility exists. Radical progressive change is possible, but only if we are aware of its possibility. After the World Wars, nationalism took a step back. We understood the horrors that nationalism can bring, and we realized that maybe focusing on the supremacy of a nation, or even the existence of a nation at all, maybe isn't the best way to focus our political energy. We had a massive change in how the world operates. The United Nations was founded and has lasted far longer than any predecessor. The European Union and many other economic unions throughout the world have also been founded and have seen great success. These institutions aren't perfect, obviously, and there can even be an argument that they are also in some way nationalist, but for a new age. European nationalism, for example. But at least they aren't built on the inherent supremacy of individual nations. And I think that's a good thing. And in fact, it is a good thing. We have fewer wars between states now than we have ever done in human history. And that's a really, really good thing. It's easy to be pessimistic when we see armed conflicts or bad military interventions. But at least we're not mass-producing invasions every couple of years. And I think that's a good thing. Donald Trump and other nationalist groups seem to be wanting to take a step back from this, to retreat into borders and nations, instead of seeing that across the border there are people who look and sound just like us. They might not speak the same language, they might not have the same skin color, but we're all human. The result of this is usually negative, even for the people who belong to the nation that they are fighting to protect. Because they're not really fighting for the people, they're fighting for the nation, working to help ourselves, not by cooperating with other people, but helping ourselves at the cost of others. But we can help each other. We don't need borders, we don't need isolation, we don't need these things. Working to help each other is a very good thing. We can be more than a nationality, and I think we should be. The alternative, I think, is worse. Putting the genie back into the bottle. It won't work. The globe is becoming more interconnected each and every day, and it's not really gonna slow down. At worst, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. And that is a very bad thing. And that's why I think we shouldn't be nationalists. Not specifically ultra-nationalists, but nationalists in general. We are more than belonging to a group of people. We are all different kinds of people. And if we all leave nationalism behind us, and instead try to embrace that we all live together on this globe, I think we could do good things.
But radical Democrats want to turn back the clock toward the rule of corrupt, power-hungry globalists. You know what a globalist is, right? You know what a globalist is. A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well.
Thanks for watching that video. I want to give thanks to literally everyone who's been watching this video, and I would only ask that you can maybe leave a like, a comment. If you like what I do, I suggest that you subscribe, because I like to think that I do good videos, but that's still to be determined. I also want to thank Baphometric for allowing me to use some really great tracks as music for this video. You can find a link to their work in the description. I also want to thank hBomberguy, more known as hBomberguy, for providing the voice of my plant for that very specific joke. Thank you so much, Harry. It really means a lot. I want to give a special thanks to all my patrons, especially Alice, Amelia Fletcher, Christopher Steinmuller, Dan Sinfield, Dirty Computer, Eggsbox, Emil Rutovsky, Emma Not Goldman, Fox Kant, Ibrahim Aldridge, Jörgen Danielsen, Katarzyna JJ, Linus 2.0, Rosie, Ryan Kolak, Zindstree, Wario Van Pebbles, William Pietri, and Rex. Thank you. Honestly, to everyone who supports my content as a patron or a subscriber or anything, I love you so much. Thank you so very much.